In the ancient book of Ezekiel, we find this incredibly powerful prophecy about the danger, the mortal danger, really, of false hope. And today, we're going to explore that message, which is all built around the unforgettable metaphor of a poorly constructed wall.
So, let's set the scene. We're in Jerusalem around 587 BCE. And to put it mildly, things are not good. The city is teetering on the brink of absolute disaster. The mighty Babylonian Empire is literally at the gates, they've already started their conquest, and the whole political situation is just incredibly unstable. This is the tense, anxious world that Ezekiel is prophesying in.
And right in the middle of this impending doom, you have a group of false prophets telling everyone, hey, don't worry, everything's fine, peace is assured. But God, speaking through Ezekiel, basically says no. That promise is a dangerous lie. And he uses this powerful metaphor to expose it for what it is.
Okay, so the heart of this whole deception is laid out for us in verse 10 of Ezekiel 13. This is where we get the central image, the central metaphor for the entire passage.
So verse 10 says the people were seduced. That's a strong word, right? By these prophets promising peace when war was staring them in the face. And the imagery here is just so striking. Someone builds a really flimsy, weak wall, and then other people just come along and slap plaster on it to make it look strong. This untempered mortar represents that false assurance. It looks good on the surface, but underneath, there's no real substance at all. And this idea of untempered mortar is really the core problem. It's basically useless. Think of it like a purely cosmetic fix that provides zero structural integrity. The promises of peace from these prophets, they were made of this exact same flimsy material, guaranteed to just crumble the moment any real crisis hit.
But Ezekiel doesn't just point out the shoddy construction. In the verses that follow, he prophesies its inevitable and frankly violent end.
And here you can just see the stark contrast. On one side, you've got the comforting lie of peace. On the other, God's warning of a catastrophic storm. Verse 11 doesn't pull any punches. The wall will fall. A great storm of rain, hailstones, and wind is coming to tear it apart.
Now, obviously, this isn't just a weather forecast. The metaphorical storm represents a very real, very devastating event, the brutal siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonian army. That flimsy wall of false hope was about to meet a very real battering ram.
And then in verse 12, God asks this cutting, almost sarcastic question. When the wall is in ruins, people will turn to the false prophets and ask, so, where's all that fancy plaster you were slapping on? This really highlights their accountability. Those empty promises would just vanish, leaving their lies completely exposed for everyone to see.
Now the prophecy really intensifies. We move from the storm's effect to revealing the divine force that's actually behind it.
In verse 13, the language makes it absolutely clear this isn't some random weather event. The destruction is intentional, and it's driven by divine anger. You see these phrases repeated like, in my fury and in mine anger, emphasizing this is a righteous judgment, not just a random tragedy.
Verse 14 gives us the anatomy of the collapse, a step-by-step. It's not just damaged, it's brought down completely, all the way to the ground. The destruction is so total that its very foundations are uncovered, exposing just how weak it was from the very beginning. And the most tragic part, those who put their trust in this flimsy structure are consumed right along with it.
And verse 15 really drives home that point of accountability. God's wrath doesn't just fall on the wall, but also upon them that daubed it. The deception doesn't just fail, it actually destroys its creators. And historically, this is exactly what happened. The false prophets in Jerusalem were killed or exiled or just completely discredited when the Babylonians conquered the city.
So why does this ancient prophecy about a collapsing wall still resonate so powerfully today? Well, the final verses reveal a timeless principle about truth and deception. Verse 16 really summarizes the core error of the false prophets. They offered a vision of peace without ever dealing with the need for repentance and obedience to God. Their reassurances were lies because they ignored the foundational problems. It's like treating a fatal wound with a Band-Aid.
And we can see how history itself confirmed this principle. The first fulfillment came just a year after Ezekiel spoke, when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. But then the pattern repeated itself centuries later, in 70 AD, when Roman armies destroyed the city again, after its leaders had, you guessed it, once more trusted in false assurances of security.
What's really fascinating is that this same core principle appears again in the New Testament, in Jesus' teaching. His parable of the wise man who built his house on rock versus the foolish man who built on sand, it's telling the exact same story.
Both use a storm to represent judgment, and both teach that any structure not built on the foundation of God's truth is doomed to collapse.
And this just shows that the principle of building on truth is absolutely timeless. Ezekiel's warning kind of forces us to look at our own lives and ask the question, what false assurances are we trusting in? What flimsy walls in our culture, in our politics, in our personal lives have we plastered over to look strong, knowing deep down that a storm will eventually come to test their foundation?